Thank you so much, Jamie, and welcome back, everyone, to the 425 show. Today, we have an exciting episode talking about securing generative AI with Entra. If you saw, we released some new documentation on how to do this at aka.ms/sec-gen-AI, and the team is here today to talk to you about it. And so, as a quick agenda for y'all here today, on the next slide, we do have a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. So first, we'll kick it off with a broad understanding of why all of this matters and how y'all can go about securing generative AI apps. Then we'll delve more deeply into how to discover overprivileged identities, as well as how to enable access controls and to monitor access after you've enabled those controls. And then finally, we have a few go-dos at the very end that'll simplify your journey to wrap things up so you can go forward. And with that, I would love to hand it off to Diana to begin some of our overview.
Thank you, Bailey. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Diana Vicesar, and I'm a product manager on the Entra Copilot team, focused on bringing Gen AI capabilities to Entra. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about, as Bailey said, a really important topic that I'm pretty sure you all are very interested in. So we are in the era of AI, right? And we have seen how businesses across various industries are increasingly adopting Gen AI to drive more innovation and enhance productivity. I want to start by pointing out a recent study that indicates that 93% of businesses are implementing or developing an AI strategy, and your organizations might be among them. However, and this is very important to highlight, approximately the same percentage of risk leaders report feeling underprepared or only somewhat prepared to address the associated risks. And one crucial step in the process of integrating Gen AI into your operations is to mitigate significant security and governance risks. And that's why we're all here today, to discuss how you can do those things with the Entra capabilities that we have available for you. And as I said, here is where Microsoft Entra comes in handy. Microsoft Entra offers a comprehensive suite of capabilities to securely manage AI applications, appropriately control access, and protect sensitive data. And just to name some of the capabilities available, we have Entra Permissions Management, Entra ID Governance, Entra Conditional Access, Entra Privileged Identity Management, and then we also have Microsoft Purview inside the risk. So today, we're going to dive into the specific security challenges that Gen AI poses and how you can address them with some of the Entra capabilities that I just mentioned. But in order to better understand some of these challenges, let's first talk about malicious AI discovery, shall we? As it is with every new piece of technology, AI is the exciting new toy that everyone wants to talk about. Everyone wants to play with AI, right? And AI discovery is great. It is fantastic because it's helpful for users to be able to find resources that they have access to. So if I'm able to ask an AI assistant, for example, show me the presentation deck that I was working on with Bailey and Christina. If I lost it, that's great because I'll be able to find it, right? And same thing goes for other files or things that we've been working on together. So that's very helpful. It's really helpful to have a way to go back to those presentation decks or go back to those files that I might have forgotten about, right? But if I am a bad actor and I get control of an identity, this is also really great, because it's way more than just asking who am I. I can ask an AI assistant about all sorts of confidential information that I shouldn't know about, like a new product release, things of that nature, right? So it can get quite scary. But in addition to that, just like with insider risk, there are some examples of unintentional AI discovery. So similar to insider risk, like I just said, you may have situations where you know folks are doing something bad within your organization. And that's an obvious HR no, don't go there. Like I could be asking an AI assistant for Bailey's performance evaluation, which if I am her peer, I should not have access to that information. If I'm her manager, maybe I should be able to query that information. But when we think about a user asking an AI assistant for something related to their job, like what should I be looking at this year in terms of a financial forecasting for such and such company? And the AI assistant pulls up something that on the other end of the company, people are working on. It could be a merger and acquisition, could be some confidential product launch information, financial information. So that's not really great, right? And there are some other examples of this as well. Healthcare data, where we are looking at PII of patients, employees, customers. So this is about doing the basics very well and labeling this appropriately. And this is not caused by something new and exciting like AI that we were not predicting. This is caused by lingering or excessive access, privilege that users should no longer have, right? It could also be caused by improper DLP labeling, something if something is not labeled as confidential or for a specific group to have access to, or it could be lack of data isolation, right? So if I should not be able to communicate with this side of the company, given my job function, then I shouldn't be able to query or be able to leverage an AI assistant to get that type of information. And an example of this may look like the following. If we know that we should not, and I'm pretty sure we know that we should not put a secret access key in our document, but this is what end users tend to do, right? So if we look at something like this, where it might be automatically flagged as confidential for a secret project called Project Obsidian, and then we might also be looking at putting these files related to Project Obsidian inside some sort of highly confidential file labeling, because it's a brand new product release and we don't want other folks within the organization to know about it, right? So now, if I am a user who is not on this project, I'm not part of Project Obsidian, the correct way, if this is formatted in a way that's properly done with DLP labeling, with data isolation, if you ask an AI assistant about this secret Project Obsidian, it should not know anything about it. And this is when it's done correctly. But when it's done incorrectly, the AI assistant could go, oh, you want to know what's Project Obsidian? Let me tell you all about this new confidential project that you should have no idea about, right? And we don't want that to happen. So again, AI is not something bad for your organization. Like, let me be clear, like AI itself is not bad for your organization, but it's the locking down of AI that's going to be critical as we move forward with these new technologies. And to learn more about this, I'm going to hand it to Bailey, who will tell us about discovering overprivileged identities. Bailey, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diana. And I was just notified that some of our attendees were having difficulty seeing the slide advancement. I'm so sorry you're having some Teams live event issues this morning. This entire content is also already up on our docs page on aka.ms/secgenai. We're having some difficulty advancing the deck. I am on slide 11 for our colleague who's been advancing them. So apologies for the confusion there. And we'll be sure that we're able to get the deck with all of the content to everybody as well afterwards. So with that, I do want to proceed with some of the content. If you do have questions, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A. We can absolutely address them at the end and make sure that we get to all of the content we have here today. Again, very sorry for the technical difficulties, but we'll continue to move forward. So at this point, we're going to talk about discovering overprivileged identities. And on the next slide, if we're able to advance it, we're going to talk through a few challenges that multi-cloud adoption is bringing. I believe there's a third bullet as well. If we click one more time, beautiful, where we're talking about the general growth that we're seeing as organizations are multi-cloud and moving toward multiple clouds. So, you know, it is the reality for the majority of organizations today that they are not just working on Azure or AWS or GCP, which is the beauty of certain capabilities that I'll dive into in a moment, where we're able to look across multiple clouds. And this is just some good general governance capabilities and things to be monitoring. But when we're thinking about, how we monitor Gen AI apps as well, really the big takeaway that I want folks to have is that it's the same as the basics that we've been talking about for years and years from an IAM perspective, and just how we're able to, that Gen AI apps are going to show you some of the issues that you may have in your environment, as Diana was explaining earlier, in a more clear way because the permissions that are granted. So regardless of if it's a Gen AI app or not, or an identity like a machine identity that may be using Gen AI, we've seen on the telemetry from the Microsoft side that over 90% of identities are using less than 5% of permissions granted to them. And of those permissions, over 50% of them are high risk. Those are going to be your create, write, update, deletes, or update and delete permissions. So things that can cause some catastrophic damage if a bad actor were to get control of them and wanting to make some edits in your environment. On the next slide, we do have some conversation about unmanaged permissions that are expanding. Let's see, are we able to advance to the next slide here? There we go. So what we're seeing, and I'm sure anybody who's worked in an organization for a long time, is that as we see identities stay with an organization longer, they are accumulating more and more permissions. So as you can see this change over time, the gap between permissions that are granted to an identity and permissions that are used by that identity tends to increase more and more. And so what we've been seeing with that delta, or that permissions gap, is that it's been very difficult for admins to be able to close it independently, especially across a multi-cloud environment, just because typically there's various teams that may be monitoring one cloud versus another, and it can be really challenging to get a comprehensive view into all of those identities. And so because of this, there is an increased risk of breach or accidental or malicious permission misuse. So earlier, Diana was explaining that when an identity has too many permissions, it may be that unintentionally a user is discovering something with an AI app that they shouldn't be able to normally. So by cutting down on those permissions, we're able to drastically reduce risk within organizations. And on the next slide, we're talking about, one of the strategies that we've seen over time folks are using. And so this is pronounced KIM, like the name. It's a cloud infrastructure entitlement management solution. And this was first coined by Gartner in 2018. And if we just click through the slide, that way we have all of the text up there. Beautiful. We're able to see that, these traits are very common across any sort of KIM offering that you would be able to see. So first of all, as mentioned earlier, with the difficulty of being able to monitor permissions across multi-cloud environments, KIM offerings are able to give you that single pane of glass across multiple clouds to better monitor those identities. They're also empowering you to be able to use machine learning or any other detection capabilities to see what's abnormal in your environment, as well as being able to flag any sort of dormant or unnecessary entitlements, something that's unusual, such as a user that works in a department that should not have privileged access, suddenly getting privileged access. And if we click one more time, it's going to show about how KIM offerings are able to truly get you to least privilege. And so with that, some of the tips that we have in terms of getting to least privilege, and again, I know this is spoken generically, but really it is about generative AI application security, because generative AI apps are going to amplify some of the issues that we have here within your environment. So first of all, something we recommend is to identify those non-human accounts. And so we say that because non-human accounts are going to have repeatable access patterns. So they're less likely to change than an end user that may have seasonality to their role, or something new that they may be taking on, or a new app that they would need access to. So also recommending that you look into something that we call in our capabilities for Entra permissions management, a super workload identity. So that's going to be something with the equivalent of root access, and being able to cut down on those unless it is absolutely necessary for that application, especially for your generative AI apps. By using a tool like Microsoft Entra permissions management, as Diana mentioned earlier, it's going to give you that visibility across Azure, AWS, and GCP. Again, we're very aware that a lot of customers are not purely using Azure. So this is a great way that you're able to monitor all of those various permissions across the clouds that your organization uses. And you can truly get to least privilege based off of historic data. So you're not having to guess of whether or not this is least privilege or not. You can truly see that delta that I was explaining earlier for those various applications. And so on the next slide, we're going to talk about how we can also enforce just-in-time access. So another capability that we're thinking about, and this again applies to generative AI apps, because when we're thinking about those users that may be accessing those apps as well, being able to ensure that we don't have standing access. So eliminating standing access by leveraging something such as PIM or privileged identity management for that just-in-time access, where I would elevate up to get approval for a various permission set. And also by using the PIM Discovery and Insights page, if you haven't explored that yet, it'll show you all of the permanent global admin assignments, and you can determine which should be eliminated or reduced. And we also recommend creating access reviews, which we'll get into more in a moment, where you can regularly check which users still need privileges. And on the next slide, I have a short URL to a presentation where myself and my colleague, Mark Morzinski, go in depth into this. So we did a presentation at SANS CloudSec Next back in 2023, all about using KIM offerings, particularly Microsoft Entra permissions management, in order to cut down on these permissions. And again, all of this applies to Gen AI apps. So really it's about, taking those great security best practices and applying them not only to your users, but your Gen AI apps to cut down on risk. And so with that, I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Christina, to talk more about how to enable access controls. And Christina, I believe you may be on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that. So as Diana and Bailey both described, many of these issues and challenges that we're talking about when it comes to securing generative AI apps are the same issues and challenges that we have with dealing with over-permissioning in our environments, even outside of AI. And they've also explained and described some of the different capabilities that we have across Microsoft Entra to help discover overprivileged identities and help reduce risk and manage access. And I just want to jump in and kind of highlight a few areas and recommendations that we have in terms of enabling the controls, access controls that we already provide. So before I jump in, I just want to kind of give an overview of the map. Many of you have probably already seen or heard or experienced some of these things, but I just wanted to kind of set the stage for the conversation. So when it comes to governing access to your environment, AKA your directory, or your resources within that environment, there are many different life cycle or processes that a user may go through when it comes to from onboarding all the way to leaving your organization. And so usually when a user onboards into the directory and they want to start working for a company, they will get the ability to be granted access rights to those resources, right? We have automations that are available to grant access to things like apps, including cloud apps and on-premises resources and things like that, as well as groups and other things. And then we also have this ability to do automation to manage joiner, mover, leaver processes across the user's lifecycle. And then even if they've been granted access, when they join the company, invariably things will change. Access will need to be removed and additional access may be needed to be added. So there's also self-service capabilities that we offer for users to make access requests themselves when additional access is needed. But then also we have automation for administrators to be able to automate the granting and removal of access. And as that Bailey just mentioned, there's also this notion of just-in-time access so that you don't have to have permanent access the entire time, or you don't have to make that decision, maybe, back in 2020, you granted employees access, and then here in 2024, they changed job roles. And so that access is no longer needed, and maybe they need something else temporarily just to get started, right? And that's where just-in-time access may come in, where you can grant them access to certain things, certain roles, to be able to manage, different aspects of your environment, but then that access will expire after the time period ends. We also have the ability to do recertification. Bailey mentioned access reviews. We'll touch on that in a little bit more detail in a couple of upcoming slides here. But it's important to recertify the access that has been granted to reduce risk, right? At the end of the day, it's really important to make sure that there's no lingering access because, maybe, like I said in that example, maybe, years ago or months ago, access was granted and, for that time, and then it's no longer needed, but nobody remembers that access is still there, right? And that's where, lingering access is a critical gap when it comes to, generative AI apps, right? The AI apps only exacerbate or expose the access that's already been granted to the user. So it's important to make sure that that access is right-sized. And then, of course, whenever the user leaves the organization, you need to make sure that the access rights are removed properly, so that they cannot come back and do things that they're not allowed to. So with that, I'll dive into a few controls that we have in the different capabilities within Microsoft Entra. So one of the things we have is the ability to govern the user access with policies and controls within entitlement management. Entitlement management is a feature within ID governance that provides the ability to control access to applications, groups, teams, and SharePoint sites. And basically, within entitlement management, there's this concept of access packages. So when you can grant the access by saying, hey, I want someone who joins the sales department to have access to this particular app, these 5 groups. I want them to be able to join the Teams channel for all things sales. And I want them to have access to the SharePoint site that has all the appropriate documents that they need, right? And so that can all be packaged in one access package. And then basically you grant the assignment of that access package to users based on policies or, to automate that assignment. You can do that to right-size the default access that a user may get when they join the organization, as an example, because that package can be assigned to users based on the specific user attributes or user properties that they may have on their profile that are necessary for their job or function, right? And then as part of that, we also have the ability within entitlement management to allow users to be able to request access. Like I mentioned, there's the self-service request that can be made to say, hey, I'm a user and I want to get the access package that Diana and Bailey are assigned, right? But then the IT admin on the other end can say, hey, for anyone granting that wants to request access to this particular package, access package, we want to make sure that there's multiple approvers to make sure that, because there may be sensitive content in the access package, especially in the example that I used, if it's sales data and numbers and customer lists and things like that, that sensitive data, we need to make sure that, doubly sure or triply sure that these users should have that access, right? And so that's where we recommend that you enable multi-stage approvals for that type of, for extra protection for the type of sensitive content. Also, we want to make sure that, we prevent evergreen access. Like, we don't want access, like I said, to be lingering for a long time. So again, entitlement management, along with that access package assignment, there's a policy that says that will automatically revoke access when those user properties are no longer existing, right? That the package was depending on. So if this user is no longer in the sales department and that access package was assigned to users within the sales department, if that user moves to finance, let's say, then that access to that access package assignment will automatically be removed. So you don't have to worry about that. Alternatively, you could also manually assign an access package. And so when that happens, we recommend that you set an expiration date on that assignment so that it will automatically expire, after some time, so that, again, you don't forget about it. The other thing we want to do, and you'll hear this theme over and over, right? Access reviews. You want to attest that access is still needed. Access reviews in Entra is a great way to do that. So there's also the ability to set up periodic access reviews for those, specific access packages that you deem that need to be protected or you need to be aware of and monitor. You can set up periodic and recurring access reviews for those resources. Either the resources themselves, say you can set up an access review for a group or for an application, or you can do it for the entire access package. So these are important controls within entitlement management that definitely help, right size resources, access to resources from the beginning, but then also over time. Next, I'll talk about how you can enable automation within lifecycle management, particularly for managing the lifecycle processes of employees. Here, I know generally speaking, lifecycle management, identity lifecycle management is a very important topic when it comes to IAM. However, people sometimes forget that it's also an important and key part of managing access as well, right? It's not about just, hey, a user's joining my organization, I need to give them, an access package, right? Or I need to make sure they're assigned to certain groups or different things like that. It's not just about giving them the access they need to be productive when they start. It's also about managing that access over the course of their relationship with the organization. So Entra ID governance offers automation to prevent unauthorized access throughout that employee's lifecycle, right? And there's a couple of different capabilities that we have that do that, right? One is we recommend that you automate user provisioning into Entra ID because we offer the capability to integrate with your HR systems to be able to provision users and the profile data, all the user attributes and things like that into Entra ID so that the hygiene of the users that you're bringing in, the hygiene of the data is high quality, right? We've had customers in the past say that, hey, we are worried about our HR systems, keeping up and managing with the scale that we have to manage with. So when you enable this automation, that definitely helps so that you avoid having gaps in data and creating added risk. The other thing that is advantageous is lifecycle workflows, which is also in ID governance. And this is a tool that allows you to automate user lifecycle processes across joiner, mover, and leaver. And so this helps ensure, as I mentioned, that not only that users get access to the certain things that they need and the resources that they need when they join, but then what about when they move within the organization, right? Like I mentioned as an example, they may move from sales to finance, or they may move from sales to marketing, or different things like that. And so, as well as, of course, if they leave the organization altogether. And so you need to right size the level of access they have for these key lifecycle events. And so part of that is with lifecycle workflows, you can configure workflows that can trigger based on changes to user attributes. Like I said, like the department change, or you can also trigger based on, say, group membership changes. So say you set up your environment to manage sets of users within certain groups, right? Give access to all the users that are a part of the group A, right? And if a user gets added to group A, we want to make sure that they also get the access they need. But then also, if a user gets removed from group A, we want to make sure that they lose that access, right? And so lifecycle workflows helps automate those changes and detect when those changes happen and do the run the workflow and do the right things, run the tasks that are defined when those changes happen. There's also within lifecycle workflows user account management tasks, right? So for example, if for whatever reason a user is discovered to have be risky and maybe potentially be a bad actor, you want to be able to block their sign in, right, to the directory at minimum, right, so that they cannot do any further damage. The other thing that you can do as you complete your investigation, you can also decide like, oh yes, this is a bad actor, I want to remove their account altogether, right? So that account is not active in my environment. So you can configure those things within lifecycle workflows, which is all a part of, again, reducing that risk, reducing the amount of permissions and access that a user may have. Additionally, we have conditional access, which has definitely a lot of rich policies, specifically configured around being able to restrict access to Gen AI apps. And it's based on signals like, users, groups, user risk, and all of those things, right? And you can leverage any of those things to be able to enhance your policy decisions, right? So a few of the recommended policies, and these are, again, as I'm going through this, these are not all the controls that we have, but these are the ones that we want to highlight because we think they are the ones that at minimum you should be considering when it comes to securing Gen AI. And so in conditional access, we have this policy to require phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, or MFA, so that if someone wants to access a Gen AI app, they have to have their MFA in order to, have that authentication control and have that be a strong control, right? We also recommend that you deploy Purview Adaptive Protection, which is a key feature, and I think that'll be covered in a few slides in more detail, but it's a key feature around, managing access within from a Purview perspective as well. There's also this notion of insider risk, and we're always having different detections. We have risk scores, user risk scores, and things like that. And so in this case, we're recommending that you use the insider risk condition to block access to these Gen AI apps so that users don't have, users that are high risk and have elevated risk are not able to access these apps. The other thing that we have across, in other products, we have Microsoft Intune, which is not a part of Microsoft Entra. However, as you can see, we're showing you this perspective of how we integrate across the different products within Microsoft, not only in Entra, but then also, products that are outside of Entra to manage access, as an integrated solution, right? And so one of the things that we recommend is to require the device compliance policy to access Gen AI apps. So that could be something like, hey, your device has to have a certain OS, version, or your device has to have, automatic updates installed, something along those lines, in order to be able to access Gen AI apps. And then lastly, conditional access has this great gap analyzer workbook that you can use to identify any sign-ins or in applications where policies are not being enforced, right? So they're on one end of the spectrum, you want to enforce certain policies, you want to configure those and see those enforced. And then on the other end of this spectrum, we want to be able to discover when policies that are configured are not being enforced, right? And so that gap analyzer workbook helps do that. So the next thing we want to talk about is, and Diana touched on this earlier, about privileged roles and discovering privileged identities. And so one of the things here that's another key part of securing these Gen AI apps and addressing the over-permissioning problem is making sure that these privileged admin roles, the assignments and the roles that are granted to users are needed and warranted, right? And so we want to make sure that there's the highest level of protection on privileged accounts. So we recommend that you ensure that any break glass accounts are appropriately protected, right? So these highly privileged accounts need to have an extra layer of protection. And then making sure that, I know it sounds simple and basic, but it's a good reminder to make sure that you only assign users that you trust and that are authorized. You only assign those users to admin roles, right? So that you can make sure that you're adhering to least privileged type policies. The other thing, again, we recommend is that you configure access reviews on directory roles, like some of these highly privileged roles, things like a user admin, a global admin, a privileged admin, and other roles like that. And then also require phishing resistant MFA on those roles, right? And so here we've listed out the different roles. I just named a few: billing administrator, authentication administrator, right? These are very powerful roles. And we indicate that in our experiences as well now, so that you understand that these are privileged roles. And so when you're making decisions about, granting access to these roles or signing these roles, that you do so with an eye on that security and what it might mean for even your Gen AI apps. I'm sorry, it's a tongue twister for me today. And then, as Diana mentioned earlier, we definitely want to encourage you to apply, privileged identity management or PIM, so that you can make sure you use JIT access and approval processes when it comes to granting access to these roles. Now, we've talked about the employee lifecycle and management of those lifecycle events across join and move or leaver. Another key aspect, and we've heard many customers talk about this, is being able to manage and control external identity lifecycle and access, right? Or external identities like guest users, right? Invariably, these guest users are invited to your environment to collaborate, but typically we think about, again, we come from the aspect of we want to make sure everyone has the access that they need to be able to work effectively and be productive. And that includes guests, right? We give them, access to certain things. However, we don't think about it when we give them access. We don't think about what that end date might be, right? For when they no longer will need to have that access. So we recommend and encourage you to establish clear end dates for the collaboration whenever possible, from early on, so that you can effectively manage that access. The other thing is, we also offer automated controls for managing the lifecycle within entitlement management for these external identities or these guests, especially their access to certain resources. So remember, I talked about those access packages. So we can still publish those resources to these external identities through the access packages, but then we also offer the capability to track the access specifically on external users to see how they're using these resources, how that access is being used, and when it's no longer needed, being able to configure access reviews to review that access, and then when it's no longer needed, being able to remove. Additionally, specifically for external identities or guests, we have the ability to create access reviews specifically for those guest users. So things like, hey, I want to run an access review on, all Microsoft 365 groups. That's a capability within access reviews. But then we also offer, excuse me, you to scope that review to guests within those groups, right? Because maybe you understand the employee access and everything is great there, excuse me, but you really want to keep an eye out on whether or not those guests are still needed to be members of those groups. So that's offered in access reviews, as well as the ability to block sign-in or delete those external identities after 30 days of inactivity. So if that's also a signal. Inactivity can be a signal for the fact that access is no longer needed. And with that, I will hand it back to Bailey to talk about how we can monitor access.
Thank you so much, Christina. On the next slide, I do want to go over Microsoft Purview. So I know we're getting outside of Entra land, and Purview is not my area of expertise, all things admitted, but I've worked closely with the Purview team on quite a few bits for Security Copilot, and a few things have come up again and again when we're talking about securing Gen AI apps. And so one of them has been that there is a Purview AI Hub, which is a fantastic place to go view reporting and different tools that you have for AI use within your organization. It also has some great one-click policies for data and regulatory requirements. And the part of Purview that pipes into Entra in a really beautiful way that Christina alluded to earlier is our adaptive protection controls within conditional access. So this functions just like some of the other risk detection capabilities that you've seen within conditional access, where you then can use them like an if-then statement to make some certain changes based off of the value. So we're able to flag behavior that's indicative of insider risk on the Purview side. So if you're a Purview customer and an Entra customer, we can integrate those together beautifully within conditional access. And you could take action there, such as prompting the user for MFA or enforcing any other action in your then statement within conditional access based off of your use cases. And on the next slide, some other things that we have for monitoring access. I think a good rule of thumb is if you see something, say something, or rather configure Entra that if it sees anything to say something and take some action. So watch for anything that's unusual or abnormal. If suddenly somebody's getting a lot of permissions that they shouldn't be, perhaps in a department that is not normally taking admin level tasks, or an application is suddenly doing some funky stuff that you weren't already aware of, definitely configure some sort of alerting that you would be able to see that. Also, calling back to what Diana mentioned in the very beginning about unintentional insider risk or some unintentional malicious AI discovery, we may need to think about those permissions creep that we're seeing. So enable your audit logs and Azure Monitor to be able to flag for suspicious activities. Also, you can set up monitoring for users when they activate privileged roles to see if this is normal for them to be doing, abnormal for them to be doing. Maybe we could trim down some of those roles, things of that nature. And also leverage identity protection for any sort of atypical usage pattern. If you're familiar with identity protection, you can monitor for user risk and sign-in risk. And so that's a great way to see if something is strange within the lifetime of the user, or if a sign-in is looking particularly funky and we might want to prompt for MFA or do some other controls based off of that. Since we are in the holiday season, one thing that I want folks to consider is seasonal access. So Oftentimes, there may be certain applications used in your organization during certain pockets of the year, but not consistently throughout all of the year. So, for example, if you're a financial services org, maybe during tax and audit season, you're going to see a big increase in terms of usage for certain applications. Same with if you're a retailer during the holiday season, and you may see certain changes based off of users or seasonality. So perhaps if you're a university or in the EDU sector, you may see that as students come back into school, you have changes there, or if there's any sort of seasonality like with summer interns or perhaps rotational programs, folks going on paternity leave, things of that nature, all things to take into consideration as you're monitoring access and seeing what's typical versus atypical in your environment. And something else we recommend is, again, reviewing permissions management. So if you are an Entra permissions management customer, you can have it run reports and configure some custom reports specifically for generative AI apps to be able to see if there is an increase in permissions that you can go and trim down. And you can also regularly check workload identities to ensure those Gen AI apps don't have an excess of permissions. So on the next slide, I do have some go-dos. So for folks who've been watching all the way to the end and you want to have just a few things as takeaways, this would definitely be the slide to screenshot or to be thinking about what to go do after this presentation. So the number one thing is to be looking at continuously monitoring and cleaning up over permissioned users. So I know that we're talking about Gen AI here, but again, the key takeaway is that this is the same whether it's a Gen AI app or not, or these security best practices are going to be the same whether or not we're introducing generative AI applications to your environment. At the end of the day, generative AI is going to showcase that sprawl and that gap within permission sets. So by continuously monitoring and cleaning up those users and those permissions, you're going to have a much better time with some of those application rollouts. By leveraging any sort of data loss protection technology or data isolation technology, such as info barriers within teams, you're going to be able to reduce that insider risk. As Diana mentioned earlier, if you do have an employee who may be innocently querying something like Copilot asking for financial information for 2025 for a particular sector of business, they may all of a sudden find out about a merger and acquisition or something happening that another side of the company is dealing with. So by leveraging these technologies, you can further reduce intentional and unintentional insider risk. If you do have access to various AI tools, definitely use those to see the full sprawl of user access within your environment. Bad actors are going to be using them, so use them yourself to see where everything's located and what you can go and lock down. Be sure to use and review lifecycle processes for employees. Christina touched on that a good bit. And also don't forget your external partners. So if you are no longer doing business with an organization or if your contract has expired and they are a guest user in your tenant, go ahead and disable that account, block their access, whatever needs to be done, get to least privilege always. And again, having good identity governance is instrumental for defending against AI discovery-based attacks. So always making sure that we can get to least privilege in a data-driven way with these identity governance tools that we mentioned earlier. It's all about really giving the right user the right access at the right time and making sure that we're not disrupting the flow of business, but we're also able to ensure that everybody is productive with the right capabilities that they have. And finally, all of this information that we shared today is on aka.ms/secgenai. That is our new documentation hub for all things securing generative AI within Entra. And we're going to be continuing to expanding that documentation. So we would love your feedback on ways to improve and add some additional capabilities throughout those. And to wrap things up here, thank you so much, everybody, for bearing with us with some of the technical difficulties here. I think that teams may have the holiday season on the brain, but we have one more show coming out soon on the 425 show. So next week at 9 a.m. Pacific time, we're going to have an episode with Jasmine Edwards and John Flores covering Evil Jinx. So it'll be a very interactive presentation where we're going to be talking about how threat actors perform phishing and token theft attacks. It's going to be super juicy and exciting to close out 2024, and we're looking forward to new shows in 2025. As always, please, comment on our our YouTube channel and on our LinkedIn page, as well as the forums that Jamie sends out with any sort of feedback or episode types that you would love for us to start talking about, especially as we start planning for the new year and ways that we can improve the show. And if you found this episode to be impactful or helpful for you, we encourage you to share it with a colleague. So thank you so much for joining us today and hope to see you at the next episode.